Okay. So, dear students, in today's class, what we will be doing is we'll be having a discussion of the gaseous transport. How are the respiratory gases transported in our body? So in the previous class, we had discussed about exchange of gases. So now we'll be discussing about the transport of this respiratory gases. So you can see here the alveoli, blood, and the recipient organs, the tissues, the various types of tissues that are there. Okay. So what you can notice here is, so from the alveoli, so the oxygen is from the atmospheric air, alveoli receives the oxygen. This oxygen is carried by the blood, and this oxygen is supplied to the tissues. So you already know about the partial pressure of oxygen at different levels. They are different. So because of this partial pressure of oxygen gradient that is there, so there is exchange of uh, oxygen and carbon dioxide that we have noticed. So the carbon dioxide is more in the tissues and that would be diffused into the blood, and this blood carries this carbonated, the impure blood with more amount of carbon dioxide is carried to the alveoli and through the capillaries where they undergo the uh, exchange of gases by diffusion. As a result of that, the blood becomes oxygenated and this cycle goes on. This gaseous transport is happening. How is this oxygen transported? In what form? So, how is it transported? Majorly, it is transported in blood as oxyhemoglobin. Okay, each hemoglobin component, four molecules of oxygen can get attached to them. So, and whenever they reach the tissues, so the oxyhemoglobin, they are going to release the oxygen and they become the hemoglobin. And that is how the oxygen is supplied to the tissues of our body, different tissues of our body. So the carbon dioxide, it is carried as carbonic acid, it is carried as carb amino uh, hemoglobin. Okay, then it is also carried as bicarbonate ions. Majority of the carbon dioxide is carried as bicarbonate ions. So these are the gaseous transport that we'll be discussing in detail. So the transport of gases, the transport of respiratory gases, oxygen and carbon dioxide is from alveoli of the lungs to the systemic tissues and vice versa. So the previous slide itself showed it from alveoli to the systemic tissues and their vice versa. So that is how it is. So the transport of gases involves two mechanisms. One is transport of oxygen, another is carbon dioxide transport or transport of carbon dioxide. So the transport of oxygen is from lungs to tissues. The transport of carbon dioxide is from tissues to lungs. So the transport of oxygen, which is from lungs to tissues. So in blood, that is in they are present as physical solution in blood plasma. So the oxygen is diffused in blood plasma. In physical solution, it is carried a little percentage of it. So and as oxyhemoglobin, majorly the oxygen is transported and carried by the blood in the form of oxyhemoglobin. Now, the carbon dioxide transport, which takes place from tissues to lungs, they are carried as carbonic acid, as carb amino hemoglobin, and as bicarbonates. Majorly, they are carried as bicarbonates. Okay. So let us understand about them in detail. So the oxygen transport, so the transport of gases in physical solution, that is in blood plasma, nearly 3% of oxygen is carried by dissolving themselves in plasma. So oxygen is dissolved in plasma. Nearly 3% of oxygen is carried through the plasma and oxygen is dissolved in plasma. So 3% of that oxygen is carried from lungs to the tissues through the plasma. So they are dissolved in plasma. So nearly 97, the remaining 97% of major part of oxygen, it is transported by hemoglobin. So that is the red colored iron containing pigment. Hemoglobin is the respiratory pigment. So they also give the red color for the blood. So hemoglobin is present within the red blood cells, RBCs. So thousands of hemoglobins are there in a RBC. So the hemoglobin is a red colored iron containing pigment on RBC. Hemoglobin is present on RBC. So hemoglobin, we have studied it in the biomolecules. It's a quaternary structure. So they have four subunits, two alpha units and two beta units. So each one of them have this heme component. So the oxygen binds to this heme component. So a single hemoglobin can carry four uh, oxygen molecules. So oxygen binds with hemoglobin in a reversible manner. So this is the hemoglobin Hb4 plus 4 oxygen. So the hemoglobin heme unit, the structure they have given here. So they have four heme units. So you should understand that. So Hb4, that is why we give it as Hb4. So hemoglobin plus oxygen, four molecules of oxygen is attached to one hemoglobin molecule. Hemoglobin has subunits, four subunits called as heme units, four heme units. Okay. Oxygen binds with hemoglobin in a reversible manner to form oxyhemoglobin. So this Hb4O8 is considered to be the oxyhemoglobin. This is called oxygenation. So 97% of oxygen is carried by blood in the form of oxyhemoglobin. So each hemoglobin, four molecules of oxygen can get attached to each hemoglobin, and they are going to form the uh, so oxyhemoglobin. Oxyhemoglobin structure is Hb4O8. This is oxyhemoglobin. So hemoglobin has four heme units. So two alpha units and two beta units. So each heme unit will be having iron. So this is the structure of the heme unit. So each hemoglobin molecule can carry four oxygen molecules because each molecule, oxygen molecule, binds with the heme. So each hemoglobin molecule can carry four oxygen molecules. So this is what you have to remember. So every hemoglobin can carry four oxygen molecules. So just remember about the hundreds and thousands of hemoglobin present within a RBC and thousands of RBC within the blood. So the oxygen that is carried is in a huge amount by our blood, especially the RBC, which carries the hemoglobin. So 97% of oxygen is carried in the form of oxyhemoglobin. Only 3% of oxygen is dissolved in plasma and they are carried through this plasma. As a physical solution, they are carried. But 97% of oxygen is carried by as an oxyhemoglobin. So remember about that. So these diagrams and other things not required. This is only for your understanding. But this formula you can write it. So high partial pressure of oxygen, low partial pressure of carbon dioxide. When that is there, they form the oxyhemoglobin. So that is Hb4O8. So it's a reversible reaction. So when there is low partial pressure of oxygen and high partial pressure of carbon dioxide, so the oxyhemoglobin will be at the tissues. In the lungs, it is this nature. When they reach the tissues, so within the tissues, the hemoglobin and oxygen are going to separate out. And this oxygen is used for the respiration process, especially the electron transport system. They require this oxygen. Okay. So remember about this. So in the tissues, when they reach the tissues, so the tissues have low partial pressure of oxygen and high partial pressure of carbon dioxide. At this point, oxyhemoglobin breaks down to liberate oxygen. So that oxygen is taken up by the tissues by diffusion. So binding of oxygen depends upon the partial pressure of oxygen and partial pressure of carbon dioxide. hydrogen ion concentration, and temperature. All these factors plays an important role in binding of oxygen. So in the hemoglobin, it depends upon these factors. If they have high partial pressure of oxygen and low partial pressure of carbon dioxide, so they are going to combine to form. In alveoli, there is high pressure of oxygen, high partial pressure, and low partial pressure of carbon dioxide. So they have lesser hydrogen ion concentration and lower temperature. So all this favors for oxygen to bind to hemoglobin as oxyhemoglobin. Okay. In the tissues, the exact opposite takes place. So low partial pressure of oxygen and high partial pressure of carbon dioxide, high hydrogen ion concentration, and higher temperatures. Okay, all this favors the breakdown of oxyhemoglobin to release oxygen. So in tissues, it is the vice versa. So in this reaction itself, you can describe it in words. So if you remember this reaction, you can write it in your own sentences. So in tissues, low partial pressure of oxygen, high partial pressure of carbon dioxide, high hydrogen ion concentration, and higher temperature. So all this are going to result in the breakdown of oxyhemoglobin and release of oxygen. This another fact that you should understand is every 100 ml of oxygenated blood can deliver about around 5 ml of oxygen to the tissues under normal physiological condition. Every 100 ml of blood can deliver around 5 ml of oxygen to the tissues under normal physiological conditions. For 100 ml of blood, if it is 5 ml, so for 1 liter, it would be 50 ml. For 5 liters of blood, so it would be 250 ml. So it is almost quarter liter of oxygen is supplied to the tissues under normal physiological conditions. So for 100 ml, it is 5 ml of oxygen is delivered to the tissues under normal physiological conditions. So if you plot this oxygen hemoglobin dissociation curve, so on a graph, you get a sigmoid curve. So it is a sigmoid curve is obtained when percentage saturation of hemoglobin. So this is partial pressure of oxygen. So when the partial pressure of oxygen is low, you notice that when it is very low, there is the percentage saturation of hemoglobin with oxygen is also low. So when the partial pressure of oxygen is high, so the percentage saturation of hemoglobin is also high. So it is a sigmoid curve obtained when you have this oxygen hemoglobin dissociation curve. It is a sigmoid curve, just like growth curve. Okay. So when percentage saturation of hemoglobin with oxygen is plotted against partial pressure of oxygen. So y-axis has percentage saturation of hemoglobin with oxygen and x-axis has oxygen, partial pressure of oxygen. It is used to study the effect of factors like partial pressure of carbon dioxide, hydrogen concentration, so others on binding of oxygen with hemoglobin. Okay, so this graph is used to study this effect of other factors like partial pressure of carbon dioxide, hydrogen ion concentration, so etc. on the binding effect of oxygen with hemoglobin. So this graph might be given for 2 marks. So you should be knowing what is on the y-axis and what is on the x-axis. So next, carbon dioxide transport. So in tissues, partial pressure of carbon dioxide is high due to catabolism, that is respiration, and partial pressure of oxygen is low. In lungs, partial pressure of carbon dioxide is low and partial pressure of oxygen is high. Okay, so this favors carbon dioxide transport from tissues to the lungs. So from tissues to the lungs, so the carbon dioxide is transported. It occurs in three ways. as carbonic acid. So the carbon dioxide transport from tissues to lungs, it occurs in three ways: as carbonic acid, that is H2CO3, as carbaminohemoglobin, then as bicarbonate. So there is a spelling mistake here. It should be G, as carbamino hemoglobin, and as bicarbonate. So 93% uh, of carbon dioxide diffuse into RBC, and they are carried in different forms. See, totally it is 93% of carbon dioxide is diffusing into RBC. Only 7% of carbon dioxide is dissolved in plasma, whereas 3% of oxygen was dissolved in plasma. Here in carbon dioxide, it is higher. 7% of carbon dioxide is dissolved in plasma. 93% of them is carried through this RBC. See, 23% of carbon dioxide combines with hemoglobin to form carbaminohemoglobin. Okay, 70% of this carbon dioxide is converted to bicarbonate ions, and they are diffusing into the RBC. They are carried through the RBC. So they are carried as bicarbonate ions, 70% of them. Carbon dioxide is converted to bicarbonate ions, and they are carried as bicarbonate ions. So as carbonic acid, let us first discuss. In tissues, 7% of carbon dioxide is dissolved in plasma water to form carbonic acid. The water present in plasma, they are going to diffuse. So to form carbonic acid, and it is carried to lungs. So carbon dioxide combines with water of plasma to form carbonic acid, S2CO3, and they are carried to the lungs as carbonic acid. At the lungs, they are going to dissociate to form carbon dioxide and water. So carbon dioxide diffuses into the lungs. Okay, so that is what it is going to happen in the lung region. So they are going to dissociate. So 7% of carbon dioxide is carried as carbonic acid in the plasma. Okay, and they are carried to lungs as carbaminohemoglobin. You can see this reaction, that is carbon dioxide plus amino group of hemoglobin. So they are going to combine to form hemoglobin, that is carb amino hemoglobin. So carbon dioxide combines with the amino group of hemoglobin in tissues, and they form this carbamino hemoglobin. So when they reach the lungs, this carbamino hemoglobin is going to dissociate to form the amino group of hemoglobin. Uh, they are going to form and carbon dioxide. See, this amino group is already there in hemoglobin. It need not be mentioned. So carbon dioxide plus hemoglobin. But this carbon dioxide combines with the amino group of hemoglobin. That is why we call it as carbamino hemoglobin. So in tissues, nearly 20 to 25% of carbon dioxide, they bind to hemoglobin to form carbamino hemoglobin. In alveoli, so the carbon dioxide dissociates from carbamino hemoglobin. So that is what it is going to form. So carbon dioxide combines with amino group of hemoglobin to form carbamino hemoglobin in alveoli. So the carbon dioxide dissociate from carbamino hemoglobin and they diffuse out. About majority of carbon dioxide is carried as bicarbonates. Nearly 70% of carbon dioxide is transported as bicarbonates. So the RBCs, the red blood cells, they contain an enzyme, carbonic anhydrase. It is also slightly present in plasma too. So carbon dioxide and water combines in presence of carbonic anhydrase to form carbonic acid. So this carbonic acid, again in presence of carbonic anhydrase, they are going to be broken down as carbonate ions. So about 70% of carbon dioxide is transported as carbonate ions, bicarbonate ions. So the RBC contain an enzyme, carbonic anhydrase, uh, carbonic anhydrase is also present even in plasma in a very less quantity. At tissue site, so the carbonic anhydrase is going to convert carbon dioxide as carbonic acid, and this carbonic acid is dissociated in presence of carbonic anhydrase as bicarbonate ions. In alveoli, the above reaction proceeds in the opposite direction. So the bicarbonate ions by the carbonic anhydrase, they are going to form carbonic acid, and this carbonic acid, again by the activity of carbonic anhydrase, they are broken down to release carbon dioxide and water. So every 100 ml of deoxygenated blood, so they deliver about so 4 ml of carbon dioxide to alveoli. So 5 liters of blood, it would be 200 ml of carbon dioxide. Whereas for 100 ml of oxygenated blood, the oxygen was 5 ml. So totally for 5 liters, it was 250 ml. Whereas carbon dioxide for every 100 ml of deoxygenated blood, so they carry 4 ml of carbon dioxide. So for 5 liters, it is 200 ml. Then the regulation of respiration. So the brain, there are respiratory centers, so which regulates respiration. So respiratory rhythm center, pneumotaxic center, chemosensitive area. So these are the RPC. You can remember it as respiratory rhythm center, pneumotaxic center, and uh, chemosensitive area are the three respiratory centers which regulates, which controls the breathing. So this respiratory rhythm center, so in the diagram, you can see that, so the respiratory rhythm center has two regions for it, the inspiratory area, expiratory area. Okay. Then there is pneumotaxic center, which has this area. You can see this pneumotaxic area. So rhythm center, pneumotaxic area, and chemosensitive area. They are the three respiratory centers. The respiratory rhythm center has inspiratory and expiratory centers. So here you can see that enlarged inspiratory and expiratory reserve centers. Okay. So seen in respiratory rhythm center is seen in medulla oblongata. This is the medulla oblongata. It regulates the respiratory rhythms. The rhythm of breathing is regulated by this inspiratory center and expiratory center. It regulates the respiratory rhythms. Okay. Pneumotaxic center, so they are found in the pons region. So pneumotaxic center is seen in the pons region of it, pons region of the brain. It moderates the functions of respiratory rhythm center. So respiratory rhythm center, it controls respiratory rhythms, but this respiratory rhythm center in turn is controlled by this pneumotaxic center. So it moderates, the pneumotaxic center moderates the functions of respiratory rhythm center. So impulse from this center, the pneumotaxic center, reduces the duration of inspiration and thereby alters the respiratory rate. So the duration of inspiration is reduced whenever they receive the impulse from this pneumotaxic center, and thereby it alters the respiratory rate. So pneumotaxic center moderates the breathing respiratory rhythm center. So whenever they receive impulse from the center, so the it reduces the duration of inspiration and thereby alters the respiratory rate. So respiratory rate per minute is 12 to 16 uh, cycles, respiratory cycles per minute. Okay, that is the respiratory rate. That would be changed. Chemosensitive area. So it is seen adjacent to the rhythm center. So next to the adjacent ಅಂದ್ರೆ ಪಕ್ಕದಲ್ಲೇ ಇದೆ. So adjacent to the rhythm center. So you have the inspiratory area, expiratory area. Adjacent to that, you find this uh, chemosensitive area. So it increases the concentration of carbon dioxide and hydrogen ion. So increase, see the chemosensitive area. So there is an increase in the concentration of carbon dioxide and hydrogen ion, which activates the center, chemosensitive, the rhythm center, which in turn signals rhythm center. So the chemosensitive area is activated, which in turn signals the rhythm center. So receptors in aortic arch and carotid artery also recognize the changes in carbon dioxide and proton concentration or hydrogen ion concentration, and they send signals to rhythm center. So chemosensitive area, so they are going to, whenever there is an increase in the concentration of carbon dioxide and hydrogen ions, so they activate this chemosensitive center, which in turn signals the rhythm center. Okay, receptors in aortic arch and carotid artery, they also recognize the change in carbon dioxide and hydrogen ion concentration, and they send signals to rhythm center. So both of them are sending from the brain. Also, there is signals to the rhythm center, and the receptors also send the signals to the rhythm center of the brain whenever there is a change in the concentration of carbon dioxide and hydrogen ions. That is the chemosensitive area. So role of oxygen in the regulation of respiratory rhythm is quite insignificant, but carbon dioxide has an important role in respiratory rhythm. So they are also moderated by the respiratory rhythm center is also moderated by the pneumotaxic center, as well as the chemosensitive area which is adjacent to them, rhythm center. So whenever there is a concentration of carbon dioxide and hydrogen ion, there is change, increase in the concentration, it activates the uh, chemosensitive center, which in turn sends signals to the rhythm center. The receptors in aortic arch and carotid artery, they also recognize the change in the carbon dioxide and hydrogen ion concentration, and they send signal back to the rhythm center. Okay, role of oxygen in the regulation of this respiratory rhythm is insignificant. So the final part of our discussion is the disorders of the respiratory system. Okay. So yesterday I was reading in, I don't know how much it is at the experimental level. People who are having asthma have a regular lesser chances of getting seriously affected by corona. That is what I read yesterday. Okay. So respiratory disorders. Today I was talking about corona. So corona also affects the breathing rhythm. So there is hasty breathing. So there are the lungs are affected by the corona. So the COVID-19 also affects the lungs. So it is an important organ of our body. Pneumonia also affects the lungs. So then there are allergies which affects the lungs, especially patients who are suffering from asthma. So they realize the importance of lungs. Whenever their breathing is affected, so the wheezing sound is created in the asthmatic patients. So the disorders of respiratory system, some of the disorders are occupational disorders, like in case of people who are involved in cotton industry. So the fibers, they enter into their nostrils, and they are going to lead to abnormalities of the respiratory system, or if they are exposed to dust, so this professional hazards, so it leads to respiratory disorders. So let us discuss about the various disorders of the respiratory system. Asthma, it is a difficulty in breathing which causes wheezing. So the whistle-like sound whenever they are breathing is because of the narrowing down of the bronchioles. So the inflammation of bronchi and bronchioles. So there is an inflammation of bronchi and bronchioles. As a result of that, so there is a wheezing sound that is created. So this is due to inflammation of bronchi and bronchioles. So you should understand about that. That happens during asthma. So the inflammation reduces the area for movement of air. And when the area gets movement at the forced respiration, it causes the wheezing sound. Okay. So tight and smooth muscles, you can see here. So relaxed, smooth muscles. So the inflammation that has taken place, asthmatic airway during attack. So this is how it gets reduced. So the difficulty in breathing causes wheezing due to inflammation of bronchi and bronchioles. So that inflammation so reduces the area that is available for exchange of respiratory gases or for flow of respiratory gases. So inflammation is going to reduce the flow of respiratory gases, and that is why they gasp for air. Okay, so that is difficulties in asthma, which is a respiratory disorder, difficulty in breathing causing wheezing, which causes wheezing due to inflammation of bronchi and bronchioles. At present, there are oral inhalers. To an extent they have reduced the impact of asthma. There are many sports person who are asthmatic, but they are performing well. I told you about the cricket player Jonty Rhodes, who had this asthmatic attacks, but he was a very good athlete. So this shouldn't cause much of difficulty. There are various role models who have suffered the asthmatic or who are patients of asthma, but they have been able to lead normal life. Okay, with some modifications and adaptations. So the next one is emphysema, which is disorders of respiratory system. So smoking causes majorly the disorder. There are two types of smoking. To an extent, the number of smokers have reduced because of the sustained campaign that the government has been doing it throughout the world. They are doing that. So at present, smoking has reduced drastically. Okay, so there was active smoker and passive smoker. Active smoker is one who's smoking. Passive smoker is one who is inhaling the smoke. So the effect on a passive smoker is more than an active smoker. Okay, so they have this nicotine which is there in the tobacco. It is a carcinogenic agent. It causes lung cancer. So whenever they are smoking it, so they let the smoke through the nostrils, through the mouth. So the lungs are going to get affected by this uh, habit of smoking. So the damage of alveolar walls takes place in the lungs. It decreases the respiratory surface. So the respiratory surface will be decreased by this uh, smoking part of it. So damage of alveolar walls and the respiratory surface decreases. So the major cause is cigarette smoking. So you can see the smoker's heart. It looks like a chimney, isn't it? So with all uh, the carbon soot engulfing the uh, livers. Okay, it looks like the soot from the chimney that has got engulfed. So this is what you notice in the smoker's lungs. This is how it looks into. Okay, so the smoking habit causes damage of alveolar walls. Emphysema is where the alveolar walls are damaged. It decreases the respiratory surface. So the exchange of respiratory gases will be affected when the respiratory surface area is reduced. The major cause of this emphysema is cigarette smoking. Is the major cause for emphysema. Okay, so alveoli changes in lung diseases they have just given. In pneumonia, how the fluid and blood cells in alveoli, so they are filled by this edema. Okay, thickened by edema. In healthy alveoli, this is how it looks. In emphysema, you can see that the alveoli is reduced and the surface area reduces. The alveolar walls are damaged and it decreases the respiratory surface. The major cause of this emphysema is because of smoking, cigarette smoking. So another thing, the smoking is apart from habits, there is like you know that most of the masculinity or machoism isn't in smoking. Okay, so that also you should remember. Socializing, you need not have to be a smoker to socialize. There are different ways of keeping your mind engaged and activated. So it usually smoking habit starts as a uh, adventure or just to check out what it feels like, and it becomes a habit, and you get addicted to smoking. So smokers, they find it very difficult to come out from this habit because they are addicted to smoking. Okay, so remember next time there is a smoke and all those songs of Don Don or other things, it is going to affect your lungs to this extent. Okay, so remember about that. So bad habits are easy to get into, but very difficult to come out of. So let there be no adventurism, rather misadventurism. Okay, so take care of your health and lungs. Lung health is very important. The other disorder of respiratory system, I told you about occupational respiratory disorders. So certain industries produce so much dust. Even we teachers at present, we have exposed to a lot of dust. Maybe the online classes, it is dustless process. Today there are dustless chalk. To an extent, the amount of dust that teachers are exposed to are less. But the various other industries, like it can be the uh, polishing of granites or those tiles industry, there are a lot of dust that is produced. So the defense mechanism of the body cannot cope up with this situation. So long exposure to dust, it causes inflammation of the lungs. So you can see the healthy lungs and lungs with asbestosis. So the long exposure causes inflammation leading to fibrosis. Fibrosis is proliferation of fibrous tissue and it results in damage of lungs. So long exposure to such dust causes inflammation leading to fibrosis, that is a proliferation of fibrous tissues. It results in lung damage. So workers in such industrial industries, they should wear protective masks. So workers in industries, they should wear protective masks to avoid this uh, dust uh, infection which causes damage to the lung. So long exposure causes inflammation leading to fibrosis, that is proliferation of fibrous tissue. It also results in damage of lungs. Lung damage it results to. So workers in such industries should wear protective masks. Even textile industries, the asbestosis, so and other things they take place. So they are the different occupational respiratory disorders concerned with uh, the respiratory system. So that completes our summary of this topic. So if you have any doubts or clarification, you can get it clarified. Do you have any doubts or clarification, dear students?